many of those on the streets on Thursday night were not kind of advocates of the far right. There was opportunistic criminality and hooliganism. But there is a growing far right sentiment in the country, and it is becoming more active. And it really grew during the pandemic. Started out with conspiracy theories around vaccines and now has moved on to anti-immigrant sentiment and LGBT rights issues and so on and so forth.
When we were discussing this story on the programme yesterday, many people were taken by surprise that the police were blaming people from the far right, and that indeed there was a presence and a frustration that meant that people who supported the far right were out on the streets. Just give us some context here. How big a following is there for the far right in Ireland?
It has grown for certain in recent years, but it has to be said that many of those on the streets on Thursday night were not kind of advocates of the far right. There was opportunistic criminality and hooliganism. But there is a growing far right sentiment in the country, and it is becoming more active. And it really grew during the pandemic. Started out with conspiracy theories around vaccines and now has moved on to anti-immigrant sentiment and LGBT rights issues and so on and so forth.
What's fueling it? What has changed in Ireland to fuel it?
So there has been quite a lot of social change. 30 years ago, the country was predominantly white, predominantly Roman Catholic. Most people were born on the island. Nowadays, 1 in 5 people have been born outside of the island. And in particular, in 2022, there was a huge upsurge in people seeking asylum, and obviously Ukrainian refugees also entering the country. And so it does seem to have taken off in recent years.
It was interesting, the comments by the Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris. He was in a meeting in Dublin for the British Irish Council, and he was talking about the onus being on elected politicians to combat the rise of the far right. Do you feel that politicians in Ireland are addressing the legitimate concerns that some voters have?
So there are the right and far right of the political spectrum is probably not represented by mainstream political parties who, unlike perhaps their British counterparts, tend to be quite pro-immigration. And this issue has not been politicized, but we do see small fringe political parties emerging to represent this space. Now, what we see down the country are councillors at local level are more likely to represent the views of their constituents when they're objecting, for instance, to asylum hostels being established in small towns like Fermoy or Killarney.
I mean, when we look at a wider view, sort of across Europe, and we look at, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands has just been incredibly successful in those elections, could end up being the Prime Minister. Obviously, there has to be a coalition formed there. You've got George Meloni in Italy. There's also issues in Hungary. I mean, do you get a sense that there is a drive towards the far right in Europe, or are people overstating that?
I think, it's covered widely in the media, but it does fluctuate. The parties have done well and done not so well in European elections. There is a kind of a backwards and forth on this. And so Geert Wilders is getting a huge amount of coverage at the moment in the Netherlands, but he's still got 35 seats, and it looks like it will be very difficult for him to form a party. So there is sentiment there, but it does come in waves. And it can be overstated, and people tend to obsess about it. And frankly, the media seem to be quite obsessed with it also.
And that's important because we need to keep it in context. I mean, we spoke to an MEP for Dublin earlier on, and he was talking about, the real problem here with Thursday night's violence was the misinformation that was circulating on social media, with people suggesting that it was some immigrant who had carried out the stabbing of those 3 children and a woman outside the primary school a few hours before the protest. And actually, it's emerged, the police have said that actually this was a naturalised Irish citizen who'd come to the country 20 years ago. Do you feel that whether it's politicians, whether it's police, need to do more to address that kind of misinformation? If it's swelling up online, should there have been an intervention on Thursday that could have possibly stopped that violence, or is that just too simplistic an opinion?
It is. The Gardaí are coming in for some criticism, and particularly from Sinn Féin, and there has been calls for the Garda Commissioner to step down. It's very difficult to control social media, and Telegram channels and X seem to have played a large role in the spread of this misinformation. And this is, a phenomenon around the world. But, legislation is being introduced on hate speech and incitement, talk of strengthening kind of the incitement to hatred legislation in Ireland. Very, very difficult, but interesting in the context that a lot of these social media platforms have their headquarters, their European headquarters, and their global headquarters in Ireland, but very, very difficult to tackle the speed at which this misinformation spreads via these channels.
Really good to speak to you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That is Gail McElroy. She is Professor in Political Science at Trinity College, Dublin.